Hello and welcome to the Mysteries of History podcast with me, your host, Nick Monk. Each week together we will take a look at a fascinating piece of history. As gruesome, mysterious, unbelievable that these tales may sound, one thing is for sure. These events happened, these people existed, and these places have made their mark on our historical landscape. Be sure to check out the website, themysteriesofhistory.com, where you can access all of the podcasts and show notes, and of course the blog, where we will give you an extra insight into each episode, as well as all sorts of unbelievable historical content. You can also find us on social media, where you can let us know what you think of the podcast episodes, or even suggest a new historical mystery for us to investigate. So now, let's take a look at this week's mysterious historical tale. In the early morning hours of July the 2nd, 1937, the roar of twin radial engines pierced the silence over Lae, New Guinea. A Lockheed Electra 10E lifted off the ground, disappearing into the Pacific sky, carrying the most famous woman aviator in the world, Amelia Earhart, and her navigator Fred Noonan. They were headed for Howland Island, a pinpoint in an ocean of vastness. It was supposed to be just another leg in a historic journey around the world. But somewhere between the waves and the clouds, Amelia Earhart vanished, and with her a beacon of fearless ambition and female empowerment. 87 years later, we still search, not only for wreckage but for answers. What happened during those final hours? So come along and join me as we retrace Earhart's final flight, explore the theories surrounding her disappearance, and examine the lasting legacy of a woman who refused to be confined to the ground. To understand the magnitude of Amelia Earhart's final journey, we must begin with the world she was flying through, both literal and metaphorical. By 1937, Amelia was no stranger to the skies or the headlines. Born in 1897 in Atchison, Kansas, she was captivated by adventure from an early age. During a time when women were expected to conform to rigid social roles, Amelia defied every norm. She worked as a nurse's aide during World War I, and became one of the first women to obtain a pilot's license. She received her international pilot's license in 1923. She was only the 16th woman ever to receive one, and shattered the illusion that aviation was a man's domain. Her achievements were extraordinary. The first woman to fly solo across the Atlantic in 1932, first to fly solo from Hawaii to California, and also the holder of multiple speed and altitude records. But Earhart wasn't content to rest on her laurels. The final frontier for her was a global circumnavigation, flying around the world at the equator, the longest possible route. Other pilots had flown around the world before. They had taken shorter routes in the northern part of the world. Earhart decided to stick near the equator though. Her flight would cover 43,452 kilometres, or 27,000 miles. It would be the longest flight ever attempted by either a man or a woman. It was to be the defining moment of her career, and perhaps her life. Earhart was accompanied on this incredible adventure by seasoned navigator Fred Noonan. They flew an especially modified Lockheed Electra. The aircraft was state-of-the-art for its time, equipped with extra fuel tanks and high-powered radios. Any other bulky items or anything that was deemed not to be necessary was simply removed from the aircraft. Fuel economy was everything on such a long flight. So it was on the 17th of March 1937, Earhart, along with her navigator Fred Noonan, took off from Oakland, California and headed west. Also on board were crew members Albert Mance and Harry Manning. Earhart eventually landed in Honolulu, Hawaii, and after refueling and some repairs, she was ready to take off again and headed for Howland Island 3 days later. But on takeoff with a heavy fuel load, Amelia crashed the aircraft and 3 months of essential repairs ensued. In due course, the Lockheed Electra was made fit for flight again, and on May the 20th, 1937, accompanied by just her navigator this time, Fred Noonan, they set off flying in an easterly direction. Her route took her from the Americas to Africa, through the Middle East, across India, and through Southeast Asia. By the 29th of June, they had arrived in Lae, New Guinea. Only one major leg remained, a nearly 2,500 mile stretch over the open Pacific Ocean to the tiny island of Howland. It was undoubtedly the most dangerous portion of her trip, navigationally, logistically, and emotionally. The sheer isolation of Howland Island made it difficult to locate, even under the best conditions. To help, the US Coast Guard stationed the cutter Itasca near the island, ready to guide her in via radio. In Lae, Earhart and her team prepared for the flight to Howland Island. Earhart and Noonan needed to make the plane as light as possible. The plane was already full of fuel to cope with the journey, so they left behind flares, smoke bombs, spare parts and other items. She told the crew on Itasca they would use 2 radio frequencies. During the day she would transmit on 6210 kilocycles, and at night she would switch to 3105 kilocycles. And so with 22,000 miles already behind them, Earhart and Noonan took off at 10 a.m. local time on the 2nd of July. The flight to Howland Island was scheduled to take 18 hours. The island was almost 4,200 kilometres or 2,600 miles away, and Howland Island was a tiny speck in the Pacific Ocean. Without the help of the Itasca and the skillful navigation by Noonan, they would struggle to find landfall. The departure of the Lockheed Electra on the 2nd of July was observed, the plane loaded to capacity with fuel, spirits reportedly high, but it would be the last time that Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan were ever seen again. Initially, radio communication between the Itasca and Amelia Earhart had been somewhat sporadic, but some say this could be blamed on slightly overcast conditions which may have affected the signals. But as sunrise neared, her messages became stronger and clearer. However, the messages did become more urgent as time passed. Earhart reported that she was low on fuel and that she'd been unable to reach the Itasca by radio. At approximately 8:43 a.m. local time, the Itasca received its final radio message from Amelia Earhart. The message was as follows: "We are on the line 157337. We are running on line north and south." So what Earhart and Noonan are reporting here is they're talking about the longitude and latitude, and this suggests that they are actually quite close to Howland Island. But as we've already discussed, Howland Island is a tiny speck in the ocean. From an aircraft, it's very tricky to find. Howland Island is about 2.5 miles in length at its longest point, so it's a navigational nightmare to find in an age before modern navigational systems and GPS, of course. Now, the last message, as aired by Amelia Earhart, has been studied by aviation experts for decades. It indicates that Earhart and Noonan believed they were near Howland Island, but unable to see it. The 157337, as we discussed, refers to a directional line, essentially a navigational bearing, along which they were flying, of course, hoping to spot land. But as I mentioned earlier, they had to lighten their aircraft as much as possible, so of course they calculated the fuel they would need for this particular leg of the journey. But what they didn't account for is lots of time spent in the air finding their landing point, finding the runway, if of course they didn't find it rather quickly as they would have expected to. This extra time, if you like, is unaccounted for and is physically burning the fuel, the very limited reserves of fuel they have. You've got to imagine Earhart and Noonan aboard their aircraft, perhaps frantically trying to locate Howland Island, knowing that they had a minute level of fuel left. When the crew of the Itasca realised that there was radio silence and they could not get hold of Earhart and Noonan, they tried to send Morse code signals to them both. But what they didn't realise is that neither Amelia Earhart or Fred Noonan really understood Morse code particularly well. So, unfortunately, they never got a reply. Within hours of the US Navy realising that Earhart and Noonan had gone missing, they launched what was at the time the most extensive air-sea search in history. The Itasca sailed the waters around Howland Island, hoping to see anything. Wreckage, anything would be useful. Planes flew overhead looking for any sign of the silver Lockheed Electra. The search ended after 2 weeks. By early 1939, both Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan had been declared legally dead. The world was stunned. The woman who had dared so much had simply vanished. Over 80 years have passed since Earhart and Noonan disappeared in the Pacific Ocean. The Lockheed Electra 10E has never been found. The twin-engine plane had a wingspan of 17 metres or 55 feet, and as yet the aircraft has still not been found. The assumption at the time was that Earhart and Noonan ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. But over the decades, numerous theories have been proposed to explain the disappearance of Earhart and Noonan. Some are grounded in science and logistics, others veer into the realm of conspiracy. But each attempts to answer the same haunting question: what happened in those final moments on board that flight? The most widely accepted theory is that Earhart ran out of fuel and crashed into the Pacific Ocean near Howland Island. Navigational errors combined with limited radio communication and challenging weather may have prevented her from locating the island. The ocean in that region is several miles deep, and any wreckage would be incredibly difficult to locate. Recent sonar missions have scoured the area, but have yet to yield definitive results. The researchers that support the theory that Earhart and Noonan crash-landed at sea suggest that the Lockheed Electra's design would have caused it to sink very quickly. The underside of the plane had dump valves, and these valves allowed a pilot to quickly dump fuel in an emergency. They suggest that during the crash, water may have forced these valves open, and they would have quickly filled with water, and the plane would have sunk. In fact, the US Navy agreed with this theory, listing Earhart's official cause of death by drowning. Another interesting point to make is that the Lockheed Electra had no shoulder harnesses, no seatbelt if you like. So both Earhart and Noonan would have been thrown around very roughly wherever they landed, be it on the sea or on land if they managed to make an emergency landing there. What we can infer from this is that even if Earhart and Noonan survived a crash landing, they were landing with no restraint, so they would at the very least have sustained some form of injury, surely. So it could well be that the Lockheed Electra is at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean, but as we've said, nobody has been able to find it yet due to the depth of the water and the challenging conditions. The researchers who believe this theory suggest that the plane would have broken down from the action of the salt water over the last 80 years as well, but they do say that the plane's large heavy engines would still be intact, waiting to be discovered. Now, a second and very compelling theory suggests that Earhart and Noonan did not land in the sea, but instead landed on the coral reef at the island of Nikumaroro, then known as Gardner Island. So this island is about 350 miles southeast of Howland Island, but interestingly does run through the line of position that Earhart and Noonan described in their radio transmissions at 157337. The International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, also known as TIGER, are the proponents of this theory, and they say that Earhart sent distress signals on frequency 3105 after the crash, and they say that these signals all seem to come from Gardner Island. The Itasca and other nearby ships received signals, but they were difficult to interpret. And as we've said, US Navy planes also flew over the region, and in fact this very island, a week after Earhart's disappearance, and they didn't see any sign of a plane or of Earhart or Noonan at all. Now the island is small, it's only about 7 or just over 7 kilometres or 4.5 miles long, and at its widest point 2.4 kilometres or 1.5 miles wide. So if Earhart and Noonan did land here, it's certainly a very precise crash landing. Now another interesting fact is that several people around the United States listening in on Earhart's radio frequency reported that they heard her making radio transmissions after the reported or after Earhart and Noonan had been reported missing. So were these radio signals potentially coming from the island of Nikumaroro or Gardner Island? Now this still remains a very contentious issue and hasn't really been fully explained. Maybe Earhart and Noonan still had an intact radio once they crash landed on the island of Nikumaroro or Gardner Island and were desperately trying to get a signal out to anyone that would listen. And the sad thing is, perhaps people in the United States did indeed hear her, but the radio signals were quite poor and no one could really make out a clear message. Now interestingly, in 1940, British officials who were carrying out their own research on the island, Nikumaroro, Gardner Island, they found a partial human skeleton lying under a tree. And the skeletal remains included a skull and several other bones. Now, 2 doctors examined the bones and took measurements of them, and they concluded that the bones belonged to a male. The bones were subsequently packed away, put into storage, and nobody has been able to find them since. The bones have simply disappeared for whatever reason. Maybe they were miscatalogued, mismanaged, or maybe there is another reason that they are still missing today. In 2018, another set of researchers took a look at the measurements that the doctors made in 1940, and they disagree with the findings or the conclusions made by the doctors in 1940. They suggest that the bones belong to a woman about Earhart's size. They looked at photographs and looked at the clothing that Earhart was wearing, contemporary photographs, and they think that those bones could well have belonged to Earhart. Now that's very interesting. And the conclusion that we could make is that Earhart and Noonan did perhaps land on the island, were desperately trying to get out radio signals to anybody that would listen, but very sadly no one picked up a coherent message, and they would have sadly died of starvation and lack of water. Now as for the plane, a much larger object compared to 2 human bodies, well, the Tiger researchers have sent multiple investigations, multiple research teams to the island, and they first went there in 1989 and they did not find the aircraft. Now you would think for such a small island and such a relatively large aircraft it would stand out and they would find it pretty much straight away. But they didn't, and they believe their explanation for not finding it is that it was swept off the reef and into deeper water during a high tide. Now that's an entirely plausible explanation. However, in 2019, the explorer Robert Ballard searched the waters around the island of Nico and Ballard is responsible for finding the wreckage of the Titanic in 1985, so he has good experience of working at depth in submarines. So his team searched the ocean floor, the deep ocean floor around the island, so this is past the reef if you like, and they were using high-tech equipment such as remotely operated vehicles or ROVs and sonar. So based upon the theory that the Tiger researchers put forward that the plane was washed off of the reef into deeper water, you would think that Ballard had a good chance of finding the wreckage, or at least perhaps the engines, the perhaps only surviving part of the aircraft. But they didn't find anything either. They found no wreckage of the Lockheed Electra. How can you explain that? Perhaps they just simply missed it, but you would think with Ballard's experience they would have been pretty thorough. So that does potentially put into question the suggestion from the Tiger researchers that the plane was simply washed off the reef into deeper water. Nothing has been found. The aircraft may not have been found, but like I said before, the Tiger researchers have been back to the island on multiple occasions, and they have found other items which are quite intriguing and do really suggest that perhaps Earhart and Noonan really were here at some point. In 1991, they found a small square of aluminium near where they believe that the aircraft landed on the coral reef. Now, interestingly, during her round the world flight, Earhart cracked one of the plane's rear windows, and the window was replaced with a piece of aluminium. Now, the researchers measured the size of aluminium that they found on the island, and it fit almost perfectly, exactly over the window of a similar or a restored Lockheed Electra. Now, is that simply a coincidence, or is that the piece of aluminium from the aircraft? Is that the only remaining part of the aircraft that the team have found? That's not all they found, though. They also found an old campsite on the island. Here they found part of a metal zip made in the United States, and this has been dated between 1933 and 1936, which fits nicely. They also found a glass jar from the 1930s, but what I think is the most intriguing item that they found is that of a jar that the researchers, the Tiger researchers, think may have contained cream, a cream used to fade freckles. Now, it's well known that Earhart was known for having quite a lot of freckles on her face and used to use a cream to disguise them somewhat. So the suggestion, of course, is that all of these items, the zip, the campsite itself, and perhaps this jar containing possible cream, could have come from Amelia Earhart. However, this evidence is intriguing, yes, but it just shows us that somebody or peoples were camping on this island with items on their possession dating from the 30s. And of course, a skeleton has been found. That's pretty compelling evidence. But is it Amelia Earhart or Fred Noonan? So I've got an update for you. This is news literally hot off the press. This is a news article that was published on the 2nd of July this year, so 2025. And the 2nd of July is actually the 88th year to the day since Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan went missing. Now, Purdue University in America have just announced that they are sending a research party to the island, to Gardner Island, this November because they believe that they have found evidence for the location of Amelia Earhart's aeroplane. So Purdue University have got a satellite photo which they think shows the remains of Earhart's plane peeking through the sand on a small, remote, inhospitable island lagoon on Nikumaroro Island. And this is according to Richard Pettigrew, who's the executive director of the Archaeological Legacy Institute in Oregon in the United States. Purdue University actually employed Amelia Earhart and helped fund her historic flight back in 1937. It's clear then why Purdue University feel that they have almost a responsibility to, continue to endeavour to try and find Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. And they even go on to say the following. We believe we owe it to Amelia and her legacy at Purdue to fulfill her wishes, if possible, to bring the Electra back to Purdue. And that quote is by Steve Schultz, which is Purdue's general counsel. The university planned to make their expedition to the island in November, and they'll be working from or guided by a satellite photo that was captured in 2015, which was a year after an intense tropical cyclone shifted and moved around the sand on the island, potentially revealing the plane. Pettigrew goes on to say that he believes that the size and composition of the object that they can see, or they think they can see on the satellite images, matches Earhart's plane. And they say that the location is also close to where Earhart's planned flight path went, and is almost precisely where 4 of her radio calls for help seem to originate from. Pettigrew is quoted as saying, "It satisfies all the criteria. Everything fits." Now, based on what I've described earlier about what was found on the island previously, the campsite and the various personal effects and potentially his bottle of face cream, it would appear that there's an increasingly strong amount of evidence to perhaps suggest that this could well be where the remains of the aircraft and indeed Earhart and Noonan are. This news article does go on to say that in 2017, 4 forensic dogs and a team of archaeologists from the International Group for Historic Aircraft Recovery, that's Tiger, who we've talked about earlier on, they went to the island with the dogs, and the dogs did detect the scent of human remains. Now, that isn't necessarily surprising because, as we mentioned earlier, human bones have been found, and it looks like a campsite. A campsite was also discovered, so humans have clearly been on that island. Not everybody, though, is so excited, perhaps, by this development. The executive director of Tiger, the research group that have been to the island several times, Rick Gillespie, he doubts whether the satellite image is actually showing an aircraft at all. Gillespie goes on to say that Tiger have conducted many expeditions over the last 35 years to Nikumaroro Island, and he thinks that the evidence that we described, the campsite and zip and bottle of cream perhaps, show that it's potentially where Earhart and Noonan landed and died. But Gillespie thinks that the object in the satellite image from 2015 is actually just a coconut palm tree with a root ball attached. He does go on to also say that, and this is his quote, "We looked there in that spot and there's nothing there." Gillespie and his team actually believe that the plane would not be hidden in the sand, but buried underneath coral rubble. So time will tell. We'll have to wait till November to see what the team can uncover. It's going to take them 6 days for the team to actually get to the island by boat. then they'll have another 5 days on the island to actually locate the object that they're seeing on the satellite images and see if they can identify the missing Lockheed Electra. It would be amazing if they could. And then finally, the mystery of what happened to Amelia Earhart and Frank Noonan would be solved once and for all. The mystery can only be solved, of course, if Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan are actually on the island and landed on the island of Nikumaroro. Because, of course, there is another theory. The suggestion is that Earhart and Noonan veered northward and crash-landed in the Marshall Islands, then under Japanese control. Now, the Marshall Islands are about 1,290 kilometres or 800 miles northwest of Howland. So it's not just that they veered off course slightly, they veered off course by a considerable distance if this hypothesis is correct. Now, the Marshall Islands include more than 1,200 different islands of different sizes. This theory is based upon the testimony of two men who were fishing on the Mili Atoll in the Marshall Islands in early July 1937. And these men claim that a silver plane crashed on a nearby coral reef. The crash tore off the landing gear of the aircraft and one of the wings. And these two men claim that a man and a woman climbed out of the plane, whereby the man appeared injured and the woman had short hair, similar to Amelia Earhart. The men suggest that they tried to help but couldn't understand the language. So they are suggesting basically that they came face to face with Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. There were some witnesses as well who said that the Japanese took Earhart and Noonan to a hospital, and the Japanese perhaps may have believed that Earhart and Noonan were US spies. And Japanese officials reportedly took Earhart and Noonan to an island called Saipan, where they were held until they died some years later. And the suggestion is that the Lockheed Electra, the aircraft that they were flying in, was taken in Saipan and destroyed. All evidence was destroyed. Now, in 2012, a researcher found a photograph taken in the 1930s on the Marshall Islands. Now, this is quite a famous photograph, which I will share on the blog with you. And in the photograph, there is a woman with short hair on a dock on the Marshall Islands. And really annoyingly, her back is to the camera. And the suggestion is that that woman is Amelia Earhart. But there were many skeptics who dismissed this photo. And in fact, in 2017, someone found the photo in a book that was published 2 years before Earhart and Noonan disappeared. So, in other words, this photograph can't be depicting Amelia Earhart. So this theory is not really standing up. And over the years, we've had photographs, like I've just described, witness testimonies, and alleged military documents to support the idea. Now, the problem is none of them have really passed rigorous verification. And in fact, this whole theory is based upon witness testimony, which on the face of it seems really convincing. But actually, if you take the photograph and the lack of any evidence of an aircraft, I mean, perhaps there may not be any evidence if it's destroyed in Saipan, this theory remains highly controversial. And indeed, we're beginning to clutch at straws. And that brings us on nicely to probably our most speculative theory. And that suggestion is that Amelia Earhart survived and returned to the US, returned to America under a new identity and lived out the rest of her life in anonymity. The suggestion would have to be that the fame got to her and she wanted to live out the rest of her life after achieving this, incredible feat of circumnavigating the globe at the longest point, under a new identity. And the claim is that she was renamed herself Irene Bolam. The real Irene Bolam was also a pilot. And of course, Irene Bolam was approached in the 70s and asked about, to explain this claim. And she ferociously denied it and debunked it through legal action. There was also a book claiming she was Earhart, and this has largely been discredited as well. So we can kind of put this theory to bed pretty quickly, really. It's a nice theory. It'd be great if Earhart and Noonan had survived and returned to the US, but I just don't think there is any evidence. In fact, it's pretty much discredited all round, really. So there we have all of our main hypotheses, if you like, and theories as to what happened to Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan. We have theory number 1, that they crashed and sank near to Howland Island. We have the second theory, that they made it to Nikumaroro, but they were way off course by this point, of course, and they perhaps crash landed on the island or on the coral reef there. The third theory suggests that they were captured by the Japanese in the Marshall Islands. And the last theory says that Amelia Earhart survived and just changed her name and lived out the rest of her life as somebody else, effectively. If you had to say to me or ask me which theory that I think is most convincing based on the evidence that we currently have, I think the second theory, the Nikumaroro hypothesis, has the most intriguing evidence. You have the campsite, the zip that's been found, the piece of aluminium that fits exactly over the plane window, human bones even as well. And the fact that Purdue University, going back this November, they believe that they may even have found the aircraft. That's pretty intriguing. What we should address, though, is why did Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan end up so off course? Fred Noonan, after all, was a pretty seasoned navigator, and this is something that has bothered NASA for quite a while, and they actually do think that they can explain what went wrong. So Earhart and Noonan obviously didn't reach Howland Island, and they would have had to have passed across the international dateline. Now, this theory is called the dateline theory. And the suggestion is that Fred Noonan didn't account for crossing the international dateline in his calculations. So he was using celestial navigation, and this is based on the position of the sun, stars, and planets. Now, because the Earth simultaneously rotates on its axis and revolves around the sun, the position of these celestial bodies relative to the Earth changes slightly, a little bit each day. So it's really important to know the exact date and time to navigate accurately using celestial navigation. So Fred Noonan was well aware of this, but at the time him and Amelia Earhart were flying, it made things really tricky. So during their flight, they passed midnight local time, and Noonan would have needed to adjust his calculations accordingly, because they then flew over the international dateline, which changed the date back again, if you like. So the theory is, and NASA believe, if Noonan hadn't noted this second date change, he would have navigated the plane off course, ending up something like 110 kilometres or 70 miles east of Howland Island. So that's a plausible explanation as to why they ended up not finding Howland Island. Now, of course, if this theory is correct, if they didn't find Howland Island and they were 70 miles away from it,
Of course, they had very limited fuel reserves and would have had very limited time to decide what they're going to do. And this could well explain why they had to make a crash landing, of course. In January 2024, an ocean exploration team from the US, Deep Sea Vision, found wreckage on the seabed that they think could be Amelia Earhart's Lockheed Electra plane. They used an underwater drone to sonar scan more than 12,950 kilometres squared, or 5,000 square miles, of the Pacific Ocean floor. And the images that they had back revealed that an object that resembles the shape of the plane is located roughly where the dateline theory predicts it should be, kind of about 70 miles off of Howland Island. So this team actually plans to return to the site to investigate further in the future. So there we have a second really plausible bit of evidence, if you like, for the location of the plane. So we have the Nicomaroro Island hypothesis and the team from Purdue University that are going to go back in November because they think they found the aircraft. And we have the dateline theory and the team from the Deep Sea Vision who think that they found an aircraft-shaped object basically on the international dateline. They both, of course, can't be correct, but I'd suggest that one of those may well finally, perhaps, enable us to find the aircraft and perhaps even the remains of Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan, of course bringing some comfort finally after all these years to their families. Whether or not Amelia Earhart and Fred Noonan crashed, survived, or indeed captured, their disappearance only adds to the legend. But the truth is, Amelia's real legacy was never about how she died, it was about how she lived. She was a symbol of possibility in a time of limits. At a time when women couldn't even vote in some countries, she crossed oceans and shattered barriers. She famously said, "The most effective way to do it is to do it." Amelia inspired not just pilots but pioneers, women and men who dared to imagine a different world. Today, countless schools, airports, scholarships and space missions bear her name. In many ways, her story never ended. It evolved. Her disappearance didn't erase her presence. It amplified it. Thanks for listening, and be sure to check out our blog at themysteriesofhistory.com and social media outlets where we'll post extra info and images for each episode. So until next week, stay curious. The mysteries of history remain.